Hey, this is Page Break, and I'm your host, Brian McClellan. Welcome to our very first episode. Some of you may know me from my Powder Mage epic fantasy novels. If you don't, that's okay. In this podcast, I aim to sit down with fellow creative professionals and find out more about the people behind my favorite books, shows, podcasts, and more. My first guest is writer and producer Joseph Mallozzi. Joe is known for his long stint with Stargate SG-1, Stargate Atlantis and Stargate Universe, as well as Dark Matter and Utopia Falls. As fans of mine might know, Joe is also working with the production company that purchased the Powder Mage TV rights, and he gives us a little insight into what that process looks like. Joe and I also talked about his start in children's TV, navigating creative control inside Hollywood, and what it's like to write collaboratively for the small screen. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Joseph Mallozzi. Hard hit Canada.
It hit us pretty hard, as everywhere else. But I'm always reticent to answer this question because as a writer, life is not that different. And I feel almost guilty because everybody's like, oh my gosh, my life has been turned upside down. I can't do this. I can't do that. And I miss going out. And, even as a TV writer, I've always been fairly reclusive. So, life is not all that different. I mean, I miss going out to restaurants. But off the top of my head, that's it.
Yeah. Right, because, work doesn't change that much for people like us because we're at home in our offices writing at a computer anyways.
Yes, exactly. I'm not in production, but to be fair, just COVID has kind of thrown all productions for a bit of a loop. So, I'm aiming for hopefully later this year or early next year and his Powder Mage. So
yeah. I was actually really kind of curious about the whole writing thing because I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole kind of researching you a bit. And it was interesting. I hadn't realized that you really started in kind of children's animation. Is that right?
Yeah. In fact, whenever new writers ask me for advice, I always tell them, do what the standard, right? You're supposed to write a spec script that demonstrates your ability to capture another show's voices, its tone, its characters. Write a pilot script, an original pilot that demonstrates your ability to create a world, create a character with distinct voices. But I always say, you should try your luck at animation first, because that's how I did. I got my foot in the door almost like by accident. I sent out 100 resumes to various production companies wanting to get my foot in the door as a script reader. And I didn't realize that one of the places I sent it to was an animation studio. And they were one of like a handful that actually got back to me and said, look, we don't have a position for a script reader, but if you're willing to write for or interested in writing for animation, this is how it works. We send you the series Bible, which covers what the show is about, and you pitch us ideas. And if we like one of your ideas, then we will hire you to write a script. And so my first sold work was an episode of The Busy World of Richard Scarry called Patrick Pig Learns to Talk. And if you go back in that episode, it's still 5 minutes short, but it kind of encompasses all the things that make my writing distinctly me. There's the kind of the humor, there's kind of the fine dialogue, and then there's kind of the twist at the end. Influenced by O. Henry and Bradbury. So I always say get your foot in the door in animation, and I went from animation to teen sitcoms. I did a show called Student Bodies for several years, and then from there I ended up segueing to 1 hour action adventure drama, and from that to Stargate. That was supposed to be a 2-year gig, and then it turned into really a 12 season a ride, and it was great.
Yeah,
and that's how I kind of established myself in the sci-fi world and the TV world.
Well, it's funny because when you Google it's all known for Stargate and Dark Matter. But when you go a little bit deeper, that's what I found interesting was that you have this background in children's and teen sitcoms and things like that.
Yeah, actually, one of the shows that I developed, which is kind of funny, was a show called Caillou about. It was actually based on a Quebec children's series about this kind of precocious little bald boy, and the kids loved the animated series, but adults hated the character. And I
Yeah.
just heard that after something ridiculous like 12 or 13 years, the show was finally canceled. And people were venting on Twitter about, Caillou was the bane of my existence. My kids loved that show growing up.
Yeah.
And I issued a public apology on Twitter. It's like, sorry about that. And it's just kind of interesting. People are like, exactly that. They know me for Stargate and Dark Matter, but don't realize that I actually got my start in children's animation.
How old were you when you started?
I was in my early 30s,
Yeah.
so I would say late for really the career. But I mean, I wasn't part of the kind of the Hollywood machine and scene where you go to film school and from there you get a job potentially as a in the mailroom at some agency or try to get your foot in the door in a writer's room. I actually came to writing late. I actually wanted to write prose fiction,
Yeah.
and I wrote a novel. And my former writing partner read the novel and was like, "This is really bad. This is terrible." But he said this would make a great film. And I thought about it, and I was like, maybe it would make a great film. And I learned the craft of screenwriting by picking up a book called by Sid Field, who's this kind of celebrated screen play teacher, I guess. And I learned the format and I adapted my terrible novel into an equally terrible feature script. But I learned the craft, and from there I just you know worked at it, and
Yeah.
then got into animation, and from animation worked my way into live action, and so on.
What was your day job before you were writing full time?
I was actually working. I mean, I'd done kind of things here and there, but my big job was actually I worked at an animation company.
Yeah.
I started off as kind of an um, in department kind of creative executive, and worked my way up to director of development for this animation company. And then from there, I became a story editor, and then ultimately just decided to go freelance.
So showbiz has been kind of in your veins from the beginning then, huh?
Writing has always been in my veins. As a kid, I remember loving Bradbury, so I would, write, in grade four, writing these short stories, very much Bradbury-esque,
Yeah.
terrible little stories. A fourth grader would write, but I remember it concerned my teachers because the stories were all very dark, and I remember my mother asking me once, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" And I said, "Oh, I want to be a writer." And I think she tried to kind of suppress her horror and kind of explain to me that no one makes a living writing. I mean, what you do is you become a lawyer, or you become a journalist, and you write on the side, and that's how you do it. And I thought, oh, okay. And for a while, I actually considered law, and it was just not to be. It was not for me, shall we say?
Right. There's a kind of a fascinating phenomenon that I've run into, that it feels like when you talk about being a writer, people either assume you live in your mom's basement or that you have millions of dollars. And
Hmm.
they don't think of the fact that there's a large, most writers are in the middle somewhere. You've got a lot of writers who are just doing it as a job. They write tie-in fiction, or they write for TV shows, or they do technical writing and things like that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
people don't seem to be able to accept that it's not one or the other.
And the fact that it's really a fast feast or famine type of situation, right? Where you land a job, or you get a book deal, and you're working on that book, or you land in a writer's room and you're working on that show for months, and then who knows what the future holds. I mean, you're only as good as your last book or your last job, and the industry can be cruel.
Yeah. Have you worked writers' rooms, like proper, like collaborative stuff?
Yeah, obviously, on Stargate, those are really our first writers' rooms, and then on Dark Matter, which was my show, I ran the writers' room for that one, and then Utopia Falls, which was the last show I was showrunner on, I ran the writers' room for that, and I run my writers' rooms, I think, fairly differently from what I hear than a lot of the LA writers' room, where I hear those writers' rooms. You're in at 8, you're there till 9, sometimes 10 at night. It can be absolutely grueling. When you break a story, it takes you weeks to break a story, and it's very detailed. Often you have dialogue up there, up on the big whiteboard. I prefer to kind of roll in kind of around 10 or so. We talk about what we're going to have for lunch, and then we have lunch, and then after lunch we talk about what maybe we're going to have for dinner, and then usually like between 2 and 4 is a perfect, like, solid 2 hours of work
Right.
that actually gets completed. And I prefer not to blue sky my episodes, meaning I don't like to sort of breed it out in intricate detail. I like the writers to kind of find the dialogue, find the moments in the outline, in the script. So my writers' rooms tend to go fairly quickly, I think.
Yeah. Do you think you prefer writing alone or with other people?
I started my career with a writer partner,
Yeah.
and it was a lot of fun. And in the beginning, we started off by physically being in the same room writing. So one of us would be at the laptop, and the other one would be pacing and running dialogue. And
Yeah.
then just as things got a bit crazier in terms of production, we started to write separately, but pitch scripts back and forth. So I would write the first 5 pages, send it to him. He'd rewrite them and move forward to page 10, then I'd rewrite, and we pitch back and forth. And then near the end of our career on Stargate, anyways, it got to the point where he was doing more uncredited rewrites on other writers, and I was tending to do more of the original script that actually paid. So we ultimately shared on screen credit, but by
Yeah.
that point we were writing separately. And to be honest with you, I think I prefer writing separately. I
Yeah.
I value the input of others. But there's always a point. I mean, to be honest with you, there's always a point in production in general where you have something in mind for what you want to see, and whether it be on the page or on the screen. But the fact is that TV is such a collaborative process, which is great, and you have to trust others to step up and do their jobs and contribute. And 99% of the time, it's great, and all too often they'll bring something that you never expected that just surpasses your original expectations. But there's always that 1% of the time where you'll be like, I wish they had hit that harder, or they missed that, or I would have done it this way. But that's part of the business.
Right, right. I'm always fascinated by collaborative storytelling, but I also have something inside of me where I do want it. I want to be in charge, but I also want to be the only one to blame. Because if I only can blame myself if something goes wrong, then I can just get over it and move on and get things done. But if I'm thinking about a second party, then that brings all sorts of emotional and business baggage and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, what I would recommend, the job for you, if you ever sort of want, set aside the books for a while, is a show running, because I'll tell you, sort of, as a showrunner, what I do is I run the room, and of course you oversee the creation of a series, the development of the series, the development of the character arcs and story arcs over the first season and beyond. Then the writers go off. You assign them their stories, and they write the outlines, and you give them notes, and then they send you the script, and you give them notes, and they do a pass or a polish, and then it's in your hands. Now, a lot of productions, a lot of showrunners hold writers' rooms when they go into production. I
Mm,
don't, because like you, I feel the buck stops with me. So once you roll into production, you're up against the clock, and sometimes it's creative. Sometimes maybe the voices are off, so you have to do a pass or what have you. But other times you're in production, and a week before you shoot, suddenly you lost that cafe, and you need to shift the scene to a park, or an actor is unavailable, or you have to make changes. And as a creative showrunner, that's kind of my bread and butter. I love to basically step in and kind of put out fires and figure out a solution to the puzzle, and not have to rely on anyone else.
So would you kind of equate a showrunner to almost like a creative general manager sort of thing?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess so.
Because I guess I would have, before really meeting you, when we sold the Powder Mage rights, I I would have assumed, I would have conflated showrunner and I think producer as
Mhm.
like roughly the same thing.
It's funny because on Stargate, in the opening credits, there'd be like a dozen producers, and people always ask, what does a producer do, and what is with all these producers? And every title means something different, more or
Yeah.
less. So I mean, there's a line producer, and they're very different in that they're in charge of the budgets, really, and so
Mhm.
they're kind of the numbers people. They're sort of non-creative. Whereas co-producer is kind of a title for an entry-level writer. And usually, if you're with a production over the course of half a season or more, you get bumped up to producer. And then, from there, you take on sort of more responsibilities. You become a supervising producer, a co-executive producer, ultimately an executive producer. So on Stargate, on Dark Matter, I was an executive producer and a showrunner. Other times, I'll be honest with you, people will get producer credits for kind of the most nonsense of reasons. Sometimes not so nonsense. I mean, sometimes if they contribute, let's say, funding for a
Yeah.
production, they become producers. Other times, the financiers' aunt had an idea for something that was similar to something that came up in the writers' room, and
Yeah.
suddenly they're getting a story credit, or a co-producer credit, or an associate producer credit.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it's a very confusing uh, world when it comes to sort of the discussion of sort of what a producer does. It really depends on the producer.
Yeah. I'm incredibly I mean, the more I learn about how TV and film work as businesses and creative ventures, the more I kind of am impressed that they ever happen at all, because so much is happening. When I write a novel, I've got an editor, I've got a few people sort of involved with the process. And but it's not a lot. But when you're doing a TV show or a film, man, there's so many people and there's so many moving parts to keep a hold of. Like you mentioned before, like losing a shooting location at the last minute and trying to figure out how to fill that. There's it feels like if you work on that sort of thing, you're probably going to be wearing a lot of hats. Is that right?
Yes, that is right. I mean, but I mean that's what a showrunner does, as the name implies.
Yeah.
You've got your fingers in many pies. Is that does that
Right.
sound
Yeah.
right? Yeah. And but I very much envy what you do, simply
Yeah.
from a creative standpoint, in that you are able to tell pretty much the story you want to tell, and end it
Hmm.
when you see fit to end it. In the case of Dark Matter, for instance, I mean, that was kind of my baby. It was a show that I developed for many, many years while I was working on Stargate, and Stargate kept on getting picked up, so it just gave me more time to really flesh out the backstories and sort of my plans for the series. And I ultimately ended up approaching each season like an installment in a book series,
Yeah.
its own theme, its own beginning, middle, and end. And I had a 5-year plan for the series, and I only got to tell put out 3 of the 5 books in the series, and
Yeah.
it ended on a cliffhanger, and it was just kind of very frustrating. In fact, I was fairly vocal about my frustration with the way it came down, and just the fact that you know um, I I produced I think something like 365 episodes of television for Sci-Fi Network. No
Yeah,
producer has produced more programming for them.
that's
And
wild.
and the fact that I didn't get a call about the show, my show's cancellation, the fact that that uh, our request for a movie to wrap things up was not even responded to. They did not even deign to respond to our
Oof.
request. Just uh, ticked me off, shall we say, to the
Yeah.
point that, like I said, I was fairly vocal online, to the point where apparently my former writing partner went in to pitch the executive who canceled our show, and he said that apparently when he sat down, the first thing the executive said was, "So your writing partner likes to tweet, eh?" And you
Oof.
know, as it turns out, sadly, or maybe not, that executive himself got canceled. You know, such is such is the reality of the business.
Right. Well, it is the ultimate kind of meeting of creativity and business,
Yes.
trying to do that, because that does happen in writing, especially with series. If you have one or two books come out and they kind of bomb, even if you have a 5 book contract, they might just say, "Here's the rest of your advance. We're not actually going to publish anything
Hmm.
else." And it doesn't happen, I don't think, nearly as often, percentage wise, as like TV shows get canceled.
Hmm.
But it's still a specter that hangs over, especially, I think, anyone who works on series, which, epic fantasy, sci-fi, you get a lot of series in there.
Yeah, and but also from a creative standpoint, I mean, I don't know how much influence your editor will have over a story, but for instance, it can be executive influence, creative influence can be fairly severe in television. I was fortunate in Dark Matter that creative, should I say, meddling was
Yeah.
fairly insignificant, simply because the networks didn't pay enough of a licensing fee to warrant uh, their participation. So, if they had paid more, then I would have had to listen to them more. But because they paid less, it was kind of a blessing, because even though we didn't have as much money to make the show as, let's say, an Expanse, I really got to make the show I wanted to make. And
Yeah,
I would, 10 times out of 10, always make the same deal.
that's interesting. The way that the kind of the executives, the business people, the money people, that sort of stuff, I always wonder whether those guys tend to have any creative bones in their body, or whether they're always straight businessmen.
I will. I've dealt with both, and I
Yeah.
really prefer the straight businessmen,
Really?
because yes, because the straight businessmen just stick to business,
Yeah.
and they will not attempt to give me script notes. Whereas there are, for the most part, they either come up from accounting or from business affairs, and or have always wanted to be creative.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I have worked with some great creative executives, but I've worked with some really terrible executives who have terrible ideas, just terrible taste. And half the struggle of a production in that case is trying to make them feel like they're being heard, but also at the same time ensuring that their notes don't,
Right.
kill a script.
Yeah.
I remember one show I worked on where the writer had written a first draft, and it was a very exciting sequence, but it didn't make sense.
Hmm.
So I had to rewrite it, and our executive was like, "Well, I kind of like it better the other way. It was more exciting." And I said, "Well, but unfortunately, it doesn't make sense. The motivations
Yeah.
don't make sense. It just." And she was like, "Well, I don't care. I don't think the audience will care." And I was like, "Oh well, I will care." So, and she's like, "No, just make the change." And I couldn't. I was like, "Honestly, I can't. I, as a showrunner, I won't do it." I mean,
Yeah.
look, don't get me wrong. I mean, of course, I will always listen to notes, and I always like to give notes on notes. So essentially, an executive will send me notes, and then I will go through the notes and point by point either say, "Great, well, I'll do this," or "How about this?" or I will push back and say, and just give them a reason why I don't think this makes sense. And rarely does it happen where, you have to go to war over things like logic, but there are certain things I just can't compromise, just kind of, logic, character, um, those are things I just, if my character will not do that, or the character won't do that, or if there's really no reason for the character to do that,
Yeah.
then they won't do that, not in my script.
Yeah. When it comes to books, I think the meddling tends to be much on the lower side generally. It does happen, but I think it's usually because books tend to be sold up front. You'll have, either with an experienced writer, you'll have a pitch that you'll sell, or you'll, with a new writer, you'll have an entire book. And so the publisher, your editor, the people that are buying it, they know exactly what they're getting. And I think that helps kind of preclude that sort of, mid writing kind of fiddling. You're always going to get editorial notes, and some writers take regular editorial notes very personally, which I've never really understood, unless your editor genuinely sucks, which, I that does happen. But yeah, I think that the generalized meddling isn't nearly as much of a thing in just normal publication.
Now, you said something.
Yeah.
You mentioned pitching.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you pitch a book series. Now, is it a written document that you send in? Do you do a verbal pitch? Do you do both? In the world of literature, how do you pitch a project?
It's all written. With so I'll talk about Glass Immortals, which is my new epic fantasy that's starting next summer. We're recording this right at the beginning of June 2021. So this will be my next big epic fantasy. So the way I pitched it was basically I wrote a 60,000 word partial, where I outlined the entire. I did a detailed outline of the first book, a general outline of all 3 books in the pitch, and then I wrote 60,000 words of a book, and I sent that in. My editor or my agent took that out, and we started shopping it around. And I was very fortunate in that I got an offer very quickly on it, and it was a good enough offer that I didn't really need to go shopping around enough.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah, I was very fortunate. But in terms of that's kind of how I approached it, was just, and I think that's the normal kind of partial in science fiction and fantasy, at least genre publishing. And I don't think I could have sold that if I was a brand new author, because when I sold Promise of Blood, it was off of the entire first book. And this one was basically sold off of a strong first third plus my own reputation. And that was and that turned out to be good enough for what I needed there. And that was fun. And that's a good segue, because I wanted to, my own fans would be kind of pissed at me if I had you on here and I didn't ask you a bit about what the process is like for you and what Powder Mage looks like at this point.
Okay, so I always start specifically the Powder Mage pitch by talking about the fact that I'm a fairly voracious reader, although last year I didn't read as much, which is kind of strange given that I had more time.
Yeah.
And then I read everything, fiction, nonfiction, general fiction, a lot of genre. And I remember reading Game of Thrones for the first time years ago and thinking, this will make such a good TV series. And it did, for the most part. And of course, with the success of Game of Thrones, everyone wants to make the next Game of Thrones. And as I'm watching the rights to various book series get snapped up, it strikes me that people are looking to make the next Game of Thrones by literally just remaking Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
And I was kind of surprised because I knew of a series that had all of the elements that made Game of Thrones so compelling: the colorful characters, the otherworldly setting, the action, the intrigue, the twists, the turns, the shocks and surprises. Yet at the same time was totally different. with its focus less on drawing less of an inspiration from the Middle Ages and more from the Industrial era, and predicated on focused on a magic system that was just very unique. Again, I mean, there was nothing like it out there. And of course, I'm talking about the Powder Mage trilogy, and specifically a Promise of Blood. And JB Sugar, who's a director and a producer, he produced a show called Bitten for several years. He came and directed on Dark Matter, and we got along. We hit it off, and he's like, "Hey, if I want to work on something, let me know." And I was like, "Well, how about IP?" And he's like, "Send me some IP." So I was like, "Sure." And I sent him Powder Mage, and he was like, "This is really cool." He's like, "Okay, you know what? Let me look into this." And then I didn't hear from him for about a year, and then it's like, "Okay, we got the rights." And so at that point, it was like, "Okay, we're looking to do an adaptation of the series. We for you call it the small screen, but I would I mean, because literally it is a small screen, but I would argue that actually." Uh, a lot of the programming on television is light years ahead of most of what's appearing on the big screen now.
Yeah.
And so the first step is to craft a verbal pitch, and a pitch deck. And so, as you know, although your listeners don't know, I will let them know that in crafting the pitch deck, it's also referred to as a series Bible or overview. What you do is you present kind of a broad stroke breakdown of the world of the series, who the main characters are, their various arcs, what the first episode will more or less be about, what the first season will be about, how it'll end, what the plans are for subsequent seasons, and you touch a bit on tone and theme. So in crafting that pitch deck, as you know, I got together with you because I'm a firm believer in, obviously respecting the creative force that is you.
Yeah.
And so we went back and forth, and we crafted the pitch deck, and then using the pitch deck as a template, I crafted the verbal pitch. And the verbal pitch is slightly different in that you're kind of looking to sell the series. So you introduce yourself, and then you roll into the tease, which is really the opening sequence to your pilot, which is your first episode. And of course, you want it to really grab you, and it's very much, I mean, that opening chapter in Promise of Blood. And then you talk about the world, you talk about the characters, and you broad stroke what the pilot will be, and you broad stroke what you have planned for the first season. And then again, you talk about tone and theme, and then you kind of get into production brass tacks.
Yeah.
How much is it going to cost? How you plan to realize this vision? And then you kind of leave it in their hands. And at this point, what we're doing is we're going out to potential partners first. Just because for positioning, it's always, I think, better to go in with, let's say, like a power player or someone with kind of a little more cred, but before you go into Netflix or Amazon. So at this point now, and it's kind of a very slow process, because you think, oh, great, I'm going to make book a pitch with Studio X, and they're like, great. How does August 17th sound to you? And you're like, oh, okay, fine. Are they really that busy? I wonder. And so
Right.
a lot of it is the frustration of waiting, and you're doing the verbal pitch like me. I kind of like to prep the hell out of it. I was kind of surprised because I was actually developing a pitch with another producer friend of mine who's actually done very well in LA. And I was trying to I'm going over the pitch, and he's like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "I'm trying to get the pitch down." He's like, "You just read it." And I was like, "What? Seriously?" He's like, "Yeah, I just read it." He's like, "God, no, we don't. No one memorizes their pitches." And that surprised me. So, as much as possible, I try to go off book, but I
Yeah.
always have the document in front of me, and that's what makes Zoom so great. So instead of like,
Yeah.
going down and checking your notes are right on screen. So hopefully they don't even notice when you check them.
Right.
So at this point, I mean, we're going out. We're still in the process of going out to potential partners, and at that point, we can decide, who's interested, who's not interested. Do we want to partner with them, and then take the next step? And the next step will either be writing a pilot script and going out with a pilot script and pitch deck and pitch to, let's say, the Amazons and the Apples and the Netflixes of the world, or just going out with a pitch. And I mean, there's no right answer to that, because there's certain places that like to read a pitch. I like to read a script, and I'm a firm believer in that the proof is always in the script.
Yeah.
But then there are others who like to kind of be in the development process and like to be on board for that first step, and want some input into that pilot script. So they may prefer you not have a pilot script. So that's going to be a discussion for hopefully July.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how much it is standardized, but not. How everybody has their own thing. You kind of generally know what to expect, but
Mhm.
also everybody does things a little differently.
Yeah.
Um,
There is no right or wrong way to pitch, but I just found that, for instance, Warner Brothers has a template that it's the way they like to be pitched, and it's
yeah,
very much what I explained. You start with the tease, very detailed tease to engage them. Then you talk about the world, you talk about the characters, you talk about you broad stroke the pilot. I find personally that the only tweak I make is that I rather than do a separate character section, I like to roll my characters into the pilot so that it feels a little more organic. And then from there, you talk about the first season, your plans beyond the first season, and then you end with tone and theme. And tone and theme is always important to them, because they want to know sort of what is this show like.
yeah,
I mean, comps are always important to them. Um, they always request that you, whenever you introduce a character, you use a comp like, a weathered, war weary Josh Brolin, for
yeah.
instance, or what have you. So it just, I'm not going to say that maybe executives need a little help, a little nudge, and sort of uh, imagining, but that's kind of standard now for the industry.
So, this are comps in TV and film as bullshit as they are in book
They
writing?
they are
Because
absolutely bullshit. Absolutely bullshit, because I mean, in order to for the comps read to work
yeah,
for kind of a blanket number of executives, they have to be such big name actors that, for the most part, they're probably going to be so busy that they're unlikely to be able to do your show, even if they wanted to. So really, it's just a temp placeholder.
yeah,
Unlike music, and it just reminds me of whenever we used to put temp music in our cuts, in when we're doing network cuts of an episode. Sometimes we would put in temp music, and the network would fall in love with the temp music, and then it would just become hell trying to secure the rights. So I remember on Stargate, all the cuts were dry, and the networks hated it
uh-huh.
because they wanted the temp music, and Brad Wright would be like, "No, learn to watch a dry cut."
So I asked that question for the listeners. I asked that question because in genre publishing,
Mhm,
they always ask you for comparable titles, and
mhm.
well, at least in my genre of epic fantasy, it's always Game of Thrones meets Wheel of Time, or
Right.
whatever. It's pick whatever the big thing is and compare
Yeah.
it to the other big thing, and that's always the comp title.
Yeah, and it's much the same in television, although, specifically with regard to Powder Mage, I mentioned Game of Thrones off the top as really it's the granddaddy of the
Right.
fantasy adaptations, but I really don't go further with the comps, because I think the world you've created is so distinct and so different, and that's one of the selling points, is that there's really nothing
Yeah.
like it out there.
Well, I have always enjoyed using Sharp's Rifles as the
Mhm.
comp title for my books because it takes people a little off guard because it's not fantasy.
Mhm.
And it's interesting and it's different and a lot and more people than you would think have either seen the show or read the books.
Right, right. Yeah. I mean, I definitely see that. I think in the case of executives, though, you
Right.
kinda be swimming upstream on that one.
Right, and that's
Yeah.
that's the kind of decision that you as showrunner and the pitcher have to kind
Mhm.
of you have to kind of make that decision, and I find that fascinating how you navigate those waters. How have things changed over the last decade as streamers are coming in and becoming the big thing, and it seems like becoming bigger and bigger and bigger?
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot, and it's tough for me to answer because on the one hand, you would think that with the increased demand in programming, there would be more opportunity. And yet, I find that most of the big opportunities tend to go to the same people.
Yeah,
Like they'll sign the big overall deals, and then whatever's left over, goes to whoever else. And then sometimes you end up with a Stranger Things that blows up, and there you go. But I remember being on Stargate, and our visual effects supervisor at the time saying, "Streaming is going to be really big. Streaming is going to be really big." And I kept on thinking, "Yeah, that makes sense. Streaming is going to be really big." And yet, for so long, it was just really something uh, uh, people did to pirate shows online when they couldn't watch them live on television, and uh, and I just kind of dismissed it for a while, and then it just kind of blew up.
yeah,
And it's just kind of been very interesting because, for instance, Netflix is a model that I honestly never understood, and it's been very successful for them. But it's a subscription-based model,
yeah,
and so they select their shows based on these algorithms, and it's all about driving subscribers to Netflix, but at some point, they've got to hit critical mass. At some
yeah,
point, there will be people who, the people who are gonna subscribe will have subscribed, and at that point, what are you gonna do? I mean, sure, you have a great, uh, uh, a great subscriber base, but how do you grow your
right.
business beyond that? And so, that's something I just
I I'm sure they have dozens of very smart people
yeah,
somewhere
I'm
trying to
sure.
figure that out.
I'm sure.
Right. Because you just you run out of people eventually to subscribe to things. So, I do wonder if there is there a point at which somebody like Netflix says, yeah, we're actually pretty happy with our numbers. Let's just hold steady. Or is it always gonna be more, more, more?
It's gonna have to be more and more and more because they're a public company,
Yeah.
and their stockholders are going to see growth,
Yeah.
and really that comes from increasing the subscriber base, and it's going to be tough. I mean, with Disney entering the mix now, and potentially drawing away potential viewers. I think in the beginning it's going to be okay because Disney is new. I think CBS access to a certain extent is new. Uh, Apple is new, but after and Amazon now with a big MGM purchase is going to be rolling out. I'm sure expanding its programming. And so I think at the beginning, people are more willing to spend money on all of them,
Yeah.
but it'll reach a point where I think people will say, I'm going to have to narrow it down to one or two. So I got to choose. And then at that point, things are going to get a little constricted.
Yeah. And I have friends who say I think it's CBS has Star Trek, right?
Yeah.
I have people who say, "Oh yeah, I only subscribe to CBS when the new Star Trek is out,"
Right.
and then I immediately unsubscribe. And I imagine I'm way too lazy for that. I just have kind of my fold of things that I
Right.
subscribe to.
Right.
Uh, but I imagine that's going to be more and more frequent. Is that yeah, I'll jump in when yeah, I'll renew my Netflix when the second season of Witcher comes out, etc.
Right. Yeah. And another thing they can do obviously is appeal to a unique fan base. For
Yeah.
instance, your fan base is an example, or they if they sign was it Ryan Murphy to like this big overall deal, and of course he has fans, so they'll subscribe as well. So yeah, that yeah, I think very much is part of their game plan as well.
Yeah. I've noticed that you seem very. I don't want to slag off everybody else, but you seem especially passionate about the fandom and the things that you work on. You seem very involved with with kind of fan groups of Stargate and Dark Matter, and I think that's kind of cool. Now, is that coming from is that coming from your own fandom of your own, yeah, I genuinely love these shows?
Yeah, I guess to a certain extent. I mean, I grew up a fanboy reading comic books and science fiction, and so when I got the Stargate gig, the first thing I did was go online and sort of talk to the fans and find out what they find out what they like, what they didn't like,
Yeah.
and it's I always respected the fans, um, because I mean it's kind of cliche to say, but obviously the show would not exist without the fans.
Yeah.
And but fandom can be a double-edged sword, especially when you're working in genre fiction,
Right.
and they can be very passionate and supportive. But on the other hand, if you make a decision that they disagree with, i.e., kill off a character, then they can turn on you.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just a reality of genre, working in genre, whether it be writing books, I'm sure, or working in television. So, like I said, I've always been very respectful. Um, in terms of dark matter specifically, uh, I kind of empathize with the fans in
Uh,
that, as a network, you want to drive viewers to the show, and sci-fi kind of did, went through the motions, didn't really do much. So obviously it's my show, so I did as much as I could, and the show was when it was canceled, was actually the second most watched scripted show on their network. And I just feel that once you greenlight a show, you enter into an unspoken agreement with viewers. You're asking them to take a chance on the show, to spend time with the characters, and sit through all the commercials or what have you. And in exchange, I would think the only thing that I think as a creator, if I speak for the fans, I would ask is closure.
yeah.
Um, just give us an ending instead of just canceling a show. Give us a movie or something. And if a network can't even do that, then in my opinion, they
Well, and that's a controversial subject in genre publishing. You look at Game of Thrones or the Kingkiller Chronicles,
Mhm.
and people get very passionate about these things, and when they stop happening for whatever reason, you get people that are gonna get up in arms.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, George R. R. Martin, what are you doing tweeting about the New York Giants when, your last book is like 6 months overdue?
Right.
I see a lot of that, which I find kind of funny. But I interact with the fans a lot because I respect them a lot.
Mhm.
So for the most part, I think most writers would dismiss their concerns. For instance, there was a lot of fans who are critical of new Star Trek, or
Yeah.
critical of George R. R. Martin, and most writers will side with the creative and say, well, if you don't like it, then don't watch it. Um, but these fans are complaining because, again, they kind of took you at your word in the beginning, and they invested their time, and they fell in love with this world and the characters, and like it or not, they have a perceived ownership or partial ownership in everything you have
Right.
created. So rather than dismiss them, and I mean, I'm not saying take dictation from them, but certainly, try to understand where they're coming from.
Yeah. And it's nuanced, there's a lot
Mhm.
of facets to something like that. And especially when it comes to writers, you can have lots of discussions about mental health, and you can have discussions about what is owed and what is not owed. And I kind of tend to be kind of where you are in terms of they talk about, people will argue about what's the unwritten contract between a reader
Mhm.
and the writer. And I don't know if I feel like there is a solid contract, unwritten contract, but I feel that it does exist. There is a bond kind of between you, that, because a reader will put in a small monetary investment and a large emotional investment, and I think that does mean something.
Mhm. Yeah, and which is why, I mean, circling back to the adaptation of your book series, I want, I said from the very beginning, I want you as involved as possible, because I want the fans to know that, we're going to do right by you and the world
Yeah.
and the characters you've created. And really, I mean, more than anything, it comes down to the characters,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's one of the things. I think tone and characters are two of the big things. They're the two big things that uh, fans can react um, aversely to
Hmm.
if things are switched up. So you try to be as true to the original source material as possible, and really, it's been to my detriment. I found over the years, I've pitched a number of potential adaptations. Like, for instance, there was a studio will say, "Hey, we're looking to do an adaptation of this anime," and
Yeah.
I'm a big anime fan, so I'll be like, "Great," and I'll put together a pitch, and I'll pitch them, and they'll be like, it kind of stays too close to the source material." And I'm like, seriously? But they want something like a wild reimagining, and um, at that point, for me, it's kind of a bridge too far. At that point, you're not. At that point, just make something else. If you're not being true to the original, I mean, you can always of course, you want to update it, and there will always be kind of little tweaks you will make. But if you, I would say, corrupt the spirit of the original source material, then you're asking for it.
Right. And you lose the people that are almost guaranteed to buy a ticket, or to
Yeah.
subscribe.
Well, that's another thing. And I don't know if um, executives or decision makers overlooked the fact that when you're dealing with an IP, an established IP, like Powder Mage, like Stargate, you have a fan base
Yeah.
that will get out on social media, and they will be your biggest proponents and go such a long way towards helping you launch. But if you screw with them, they're going to be the biggest pain in the ass,
Yeah.
and you're going to regret it. I mean, guaranteed you're going to regret it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are ways to keep them happy.
I wanted to fit one thing in really really quickly. I wanted you to tell me a little bit about Suji, because you have a couple of elderly pugs.
I
That
have I have I have one elderly pug.
Okay, one elderly pug, and then you've got more than one, right?
Well,
One
no, no,
dog.
I had 3
Okay.
before, and then 2 of them passed away, and we got a French bulldog, and
Oh,
then we got
okay.
Suji, and then one of the pugs passed away, and then my Frenchie passed away, um, end of 2019, and so now it's just Suji. She's like an only dog,
Oh
and,
no.
but she's an internet star. She has, like, more followers on Instagram, than I do on Twitter.
Yeah.
My wife dresses her up in all these fancy outfits. In fact, her wardrobe is 3 times the size of my wife's wardrobe. And she was a rescue pug. We ended up
Yeah.
adopting her when she first came to us. She couldn't walk. She came with a wheelchair. And then we ultimately got her walking, first with a sling, then we went to hydrotherapy and laser therapy. We gave her massages, and now she can walk without the wheelchair. She's quite a wobbly, cantankerous walker. Does not like
Yeah.
other dogs. Is indifferent to people, but really likes snacks.
Oh, so just like me.
Well, I guess so. Or like any celebrity, it's kind of funny. Whenever we go out, it's mind blowing, but there are occasions when people will recognize her
Oh, that's
and they'll
crazy.
want to take a picture with her. And like any celebrity, you're like, oh my gosh, I love you. You're so amazing. And then you get to be in the picture with them, and they don't want to have anything to do with you. And that's Suja. She's always like trying to get out of the photo.
Yeah.
So yeah, very celebrity, very
Oh,
diva.
oh, that's very funny. I I thought it was kind of cool because most people shy away from adopting older pets, older dogs, because there's not you're not going to have the longevity with them, and
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
you don't get as much of the, I guess, the fun of living a long life with them, and
Yeah.
before it's the end. And my wife and I have always adopted, but
Mhm.
our dogs have always been a little bit younger, I think. But I think it's really cool.
Yeah, for me, it's just kind of heartbreaking when I think of these dogs who, were raised in good homes, then either because they're having trouble walking or having other issues, they're given up, or sometimes their elderly owner passes away. And so, if it's a small thing, but like you said, you don't have as much time with them, which is kind of heartbreaking, which
Yeah.
is, also sort of why I would love to get like a bunch of them. But Suji does not play with with others, so she's an only dog for now.
Oh, that's great. So I have one last question for you.
Yeah, shoot.
What is the last meal that totally blew your mind?
Totally blew my mind. I mean, I just
Yeah.
went out. I'll tell you what I did today, which is kind of crazy. Didn't really blow
Okay.
my mind, but we went to this place called Maddie's Patties. This is burger place that does kind of like crispy smash cheeseburgers, and texturally they're like amazing. And then for dessert, we went to a place called Tokyo Hot Chicken that serves a spicy fried chicken sandwich with 2 scoops of vanilla ice cream. Uh, and I did that for dessert.
I, I
Um,
I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, on the other hand, I love chicken and waffles smothered
uh,
in maple syrup. So
yeah,
maybe I'd be okay with that.
I think you might be okay with that. It was a bit messy, bit messy.
Yeah.
Uh, in terms of mind blowing,
Now,
damn,
can
that's a tough
you
one. I would think. I mean, every time I go to Tokyo, I try to go to Tokyo every year, but I haven't been for several years,
Yeah.
just because of scheduling and pandemic and old dogs. But every time I go there, um, I will have at least a half dozen meals that will just kind of blow my mind, whether it just be sushi or they do. I mean, they do French food, frankly, better than I've had in France. They do Italian food, often, sometimes better than some of the home cooking I've had. It's amazing,
Yeah.
amazing.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, because you love. I don't. I know that you tweet a lot about weird foods, but I was curious whether you like to eat a lot of weird foods.
I, you know, I'm an adventurous eater. I
Yeah.
will pretty much try most anything. But there are things I like I mentioned them: sushi, cheese, smash burgers, and fried chicken. Oh, and boozy ice cream is something. It's very dangerous. There's a place that opened up just around the corner from my place that serves a boozy ice cream, bourbon chocolate, and
Ooh.
a whiskey laced salted caramel. I'm in trouble. I'm in trouble.
That sounds dangerous.
It is.
Oh, that's great. That was writer and producer Joseph Mallozzi. Thanks again to Joe for joining me. You can find links to Joe's social media down in the show notes. You can find me, as always, at brianmcclellan.com. Special thanks to James Sutter for music and Tom Bishop for production. If you'd like to support the podcast, head over to patreon.com/pagebreak or buy my books in ebook, paperback, or audio. Don't forget to like, and subscribe.